Welcome to episode 13 of Kontrarian Korner. Today we have Jim Kunstler on. I was getting some questions after I had Tom Luongo and Dave Collum on the podcast. They were asking, when's Jim coming on? So I figured I'd have to reach out to him. But he's the author of The Long Emergency. He's got a great podcast. He writes Mondays and Fridays over on his Substack and on his website, and you'll see him pop up on Zero Hedge once in a while. But lots of interesting stuff to read, lots of interesting stuff that he says. So, Jim, thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Ben.
Yeah, so the obvious recent events around Trump, I think, would be a good place to start because it's hard to focus on much else. But I think it's one of those things where unless someone takes a second run at him, then I think he's basically a lock at this point. So
yeah, kind of looking like it.
Curious to hear your thoughts on what the setup might look like, what the Democrats might do. I know there's basically a circular firing squad going on in the Democratic Party right now, but it's going to be a wild 4 or 5 months, I think. I'd be curious to hear how you think it might play out.
Exactly. There's an awful lot of room between now and the election for strange things to happen. And just in the last week, for example, we've had an amazing cavalcade of kind of event-changing, nation-changing, life-changing news events. And it's really striking, between the assassination incident, the Supreme Court decisions that have struck down, at least for now, the special prosecutor, the vice presidential thing, the Republican convention going on, and of course the travails of Joe Biden, our phantom president. The whole thing is so weird. I've lived a long life, and I thought it would be hard to beat the hippie era. I got to school in 1966, college, and I was there from like the dawning of the age of Aquarius to the full bloom of it, and to actually the point where the head of the fish rotted out when Charlie Manson became a hippie. And I thought those are weird times, but they don't hold a candle to this. As much as we were against the establishment at the time, the establishment now is far more sinister. And probably what's really weird is that the former hippies of my boomer generation are now all totally in favor of the establishment, and its evil doings. They're totally on board with censorship of speech. They're totally on board with war. They're totally on board with every kind of mischief that a deep state could possibly inflict, and the trips that it could lay on the population. So it's just astounding. Now, I think many of us are a little disturbed that for now, it appears that nothing is beneath the Democratic Party. Oh, and by the way, I'm still a registered Democrat from the 1972 election when, George McGovern was running. And that was my first opportunity to vote in a presidential election. And I haven't changed my registration, although my girlfriend keeps on kind of nagging me to do it. But Scott Adams said something, made an impression on me yesterday on his podcast. He said he remains a registered Democrat just for safety's sake, so that, he doesn't get even more persecuted than he already has been. And that's kind of, I think that's a thoughtful and useful position. So we can't overstate the kind of mischief that the Democratic Party might get us into between now and November. Pretty spooky.
Well, I think some of the stuff too you see going on is just completely absurd, where it goes against anyone who would take one look at some of the stuff with any logical thinking. And it's just like the exact opposite. It's completely inverted. And like, you go and look at what's happening in Ukraine, you go and look at what's happening around the world, and some of the stuff that our government is involved in or has influence on. And it seems to be, there's no limit to what, like no line they won't cross.
There's no limit to the absurdity that they want to just stick in your face. And part of the it appears that their motive is partly to just say, "Look what we can do to you." You know, like this.
The demoralization campaign.
Absolutely. Like last year, and the last 2 years, with their campaign to jam all those drag queens in the classroom, it was, I think people misunderstand what they're seeing there. These are not men who are presenting themselves as women. These are men who are presenting women as monsters. That's the message of the drag queen story hour. And that's can you imagine inflicting that on on an impressionable child? It's just incredible. So I think they've shot their wad, and one of the features of this week's rather momentous events is you're really getting a feeling that we've gone over the waterfall now, and it's like that line from the old Hemingway story. How did you go broke? And the guy answers, well, all of a sudden, or slowly, and then all at once. And that seems to be what's happened with the woke Jacobin rebellion in the USA. It just seems to be now cascading over into ruin. And I hope it does, because it's been the worst trip probably ever laid on the USA unnecessarily. I mean, there was no reason that anybody had to do it, except when you consider the fact that we have this deep state permanent bureaucracy that has gone insane attempting to defend its perquisites and its privileges, and doesn't want them taken away. And now, of course, the actual people who are members of that cohort many of them will probably face some kind of investigation and prosecution for actual real crimes, and for serious ones like sedition and treason. So it's not hard to understand, if they are still holding the levers of power, that they're going to use them as far as possible to defend themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hope there's consequences for some of the stuff that goes on, but or has happened over the last 5, 10, 15 years, probably even longer. But you just look at some of the stuff that's going on, and it's, I think, motivated by kind of a hatred of large chunks of the country, and like it's frustrating to watch, because I think that's where like you get the legitimacy starting being questioned, and then it all happens at once. And I think we're kind of in that twilight zone where it's all starting to happen very quickly, and it's going to be an interesting 4 or 5 months heading into the election.
There's another feature. There's another feature of the woke rebellion, if that's what we call this era, that I don't think is that well understood. A big feature of it is that it's extremely sadistic. Those activists are sadists. They get a lot. They derive a lot of pleasure from punishing their enemies, and it's much more important to them than the supposed issues that they're representing.
Yeah, the other thing too is, like, you look at some of the reaction from certain parts of social media where people are saying, like, how could you miss, or like some of this stuff about, like, obviously wishing the worst. And it's like, I think even like some of that's probably clickbait, sure, and like trying to get eyeballs, but at the same time that you look at, it's like, I think most of the people that are maybe more conservative or on the right or whatever you want to call it, like, no one looks at Biden as like, yeah, that's what should happen, right? It's not. It's just,
yeah.
it's
There's
just
no
madness.
question. I mean, what you're seeing is what you're getting. It's self-evident. You don't have to dive down a deep rabbit hole to understand it.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's interesting to see some of these societal shifts. You've written about some of that stuff you think is coming in the log emergency, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the kind of idea of a slow decline of America, or the U.S. empire, however you want to put it, and how you think life might shift in coming decades in maybe cities or like more rural areas? I know you talked about how the cities with the massive skyscraper offices, like that's going to be a thing of the past. But so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, thank you. The Long Emergency book was published in 2005, and it kind of came as an outgrowth of a series of other nonfiction books that I wrote about architecture and urban design. I was trying to account for why and how we messed up the landscape of America so badly, and in the process of doing it, really messed up our living arrangements, the way that we conduct our daily lives, and stuck ourselves in these suburban wastelands, which have much more powerfully deleterious effects on us than are understood. And I mean, you can go so far as to understand that, you go out to a suburban commercial highway strip full of burger shacks and muffler shops and the usual kind of commercial jizz that's out there. And most people say, oh, the problem with it is it's ugly. But that's not really the problem. The problem is not that it's ugly, or their other complaint is that it's all the same, right? Oh, it's all the same. You can't tell where you are. The problem is that it's all the same low quality shit. There's nothing there's nothing redeeming in it. And if you study it enough, you have to come to the conclusion that I did, that it represents a very powerful and spooky thing. I call it entropy made visible. And entropy is that force in nature that you don't want to fuck around with, because entropy represents the forces that are tending you towards death or stasis or being immobile, or any combination of those things. And that's what our living arrangements have become, and it has taken a huge toll on the American spirit. For one thing, these environments, these suburban environments, are absolutely terrible places for kids to grow up, and for reasons that are not that difficult to explain. For example, they don't have an opportunity to develop a sense of their personal sovereignty, which is to say, how they move themselves and their bodies through their environment and make choices about where they're going to go, and learn wayfinding through their environment on their own without assistance. Every suburban kid has to be carted around by the family chauffeur mom to wherever it's going. And you don't have a kid who can on its own go out and learn how to use his environment and begin to be slowly immersed in adult activities, like learning how to buy something, learning how to buy a bottle of Coke, which I learned how to use a Coke machine when I was about 6 years old, and I walked to school in 1954. And kids don't learn that. So it's very unfortunate. Now, the whole question of how this is going to sort itself out, I think, can be mystifying to a lot of people, because all that stuff is there, and what are we going to do about it? But let's start with the cities. Okay, we have developed these giant metroplex cities. They have, the one thing you can say about all of them is they've attained a scale that is not consistent with the realities of the future, especially the resource and capital realities of the future, that will allow them to maintain themselves and to actually elaborate themselves further in any plausible way. So, but the catch is they're all very different. New York City and Houston are very different organisms. Ditto Atlanta, Los Angeles, San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera. You could probably make one distinction, that we have the old cities of the East and the newer cities of the West, and so on. But in general, to take New York City, for example, New York City is probably the most extreme example of concentration of density and high-rise office towers and residential towers. And what we're learning now, as a kind of a result of the COVID thing, is that the skyscrapers are obsolete. The office tower is obsolete because a lot of companies don't even want their employees to come in anymore. It's more efficient for them to work from home, and it's less costly for a company to rent all those huge amounts of office space, a whole floor of a skyscraper, and so that's not happening. And these big buildings are running at about 40% occupancy now, and they can't cover their taxes or their mortgages. They are mortgaged because a skyscraper is a business venture built with other people's money, that is borrowed money, loans, and they have mortgages that have to be paid back. And they're not structured the same way as residential mortgages, but they're still basically loans. And of course, the maintenance and all that stuff. So they're going to become increasingly, they're going to lose their value, as is happening as we speak. We're seeing fire sales of 50-story buildings that were priced at $500 million 5 years ago, and now they're being sold for $40 million. And they can't really be easily retrofitted into residential for various logistical, physical reasons. Like in an office skyscraper, you basically have one plumbing stack, and
one bathroom per floor. Basically.
Exactly. And imagine the cost involved in subdividing all the floors into apartments and reconfiguring the heating and the plumbing, and it's just not going to happen.
Well, I mean, you might as well just tear it down and rebuild it at that point. And that's
but that raises other problems, which are namely the fact that the demolition or the salvage value of these buildings, and they do have salvage value because we're going to get to a point where we don't have access to the kind of modular building materials that have been common in our time in the last 100 years. And I'm talking about things like, I-beams and aluminum trusses and aluminum sashes for the windows and huge expanses of plate glass and, copper tubing and wiring and, all these things. Sheetrock, it seems like a very mundane product. But it really requires long supply chains and complex manufacturing procedures to make it, and we may not, it may not be available to even work with. So anyway, a huge problem. Then you have to consider that the residential skyscrapers are accessories to the office towers. If people aren't working in the office towers, fewer people are going to be renting the residential towers. So that whole business model is really gone. And what it translates into is far less revenue for these cities, far less ability for them to take care of themselves, take care of the people in them, and fix themselves and fix their infrastructure. So what you're going to see is we're at the beginning of a long stage of contraction of American cities. Now, like I said, they have different characteristics. The cities like Houston and Atlanta are mainly going to, their failure is mainly going to be a suburban fabric failure. The failure of suburbia, I think, is self-evident. You don't have to really, spend a half an hour parsing it out. A lot of it really depends on whether we're going to remain a mass motoring society. And that is beginning to fail in interesting ways that we weren't really prepared for. Many of these things are unanticipated consequences of choices that we've made. For example, a lot of us thought that the mass motoring thing would come to an end because of the oil situation. It turns out it has much more to do right now with the whole financing model of the industry. Americans are used to buying cars on installment loans, and that's how they do it. And the whole industry is geared toward that. And the middle class has been deteriorating so badly, getting squashed and crushed so badly, that there are fewer and fewer people who qualify for car loans to buy new cars. Meanwhile, we've got these tremendous problems in the financial sector, which are destroying the dollar, creating tremendous inflation. And the cars now come at a price that many people who previously could buy cars now can't afford to buy cars. I mean, you can't buy
to add to that too, you had like the whole cash for clunkers thing where like a bunch of the older would be cheap used vehicles are now no longer there as an option. So
Yeah, well, that was that was kind of a transient situation. It lasted for a couple of years, but it was a symptom certainly of the disorder in the business model. Okay,
yeah.
and so what happened? The response of the auto industry was to start bending over backwards to give people outlandish loans, like 8-year loans for a used car that's going to lose all its value as collateral after the first 2 years, right? And so that whole model is kind of screwed. And they're running out of options. And one thing another thing you have to consider: the automobile companies have to operate at scale. General Motors has to sell 1 million plus, whatever their figure is, units a year. General Motors is not going to survive if it's only selling 340,000 units a year. It just isn't. It's not, and there's no way of reworking that model. I don't see it going really back to kind of a boutique auto manufacturer kind of model. If anything, it's going to be a kind of a salvage situation where there's going to be a lot of hardware above the ground. And there will be some shrewd young people who will learn how to fix these things. They'll have machine shops, and they'll be able to retrofit our more complex cars of today with simpler engines that don't run on computers. But altogether, I think you can see the auto age. You can see the twilight of the auto age ahead. So these are the problems of American cities and suburbs, which is where most of the people live. The small towns of America are the places that have suffered the worst disinvestment and are in the worst condition. But the good news is the action is going to be moving out there because of the general trends that we're going to be seeing. And they are sitting there waiting to be reactivated, repopulated, and fixed. And one of the big reasons that's going to happen is the places that exist in proximity to good farming are going to have much more value in the future. And I think we can state categorically that agribiz, industrial agriculture, is going to get into a lot of trouble. It already is. The business model for that is just as impaired as the business model for the auto industry. And so we're going to have to do more farming at a smaller scale, more distributed better, probably requiring more human attention and work, possibly requiring more animal labor and less mechanization. We don't really know how that's going to shake out yet. But, if you're going to have trouble with motor vehicles of any kind, that implies you're going to have problems with agricultural motor vehicles. So the small towns is where a lot of the action is going to be moving. The big question is, how disorderly is that transition going to be? And I think that we'll see it'll be very disorderly for the cities, because once they start hurting for revenue really badly, you'll see a lot of bad behavior in the cities, a lot more crime, which is already bad, a lot more kind of just homelessness and all the bad behavior that comes with that, and just a lot of fighting between different ethnic groups, eventually over who gets to control those parts of the city that retain some value. The cities are going to contract severely, but there will be parts of some of them, maybe all of them, that will retain value. Most cities in America, in the world, really, occupy important geographical sites. So they're there for a reason. Detroit is on a short river, kind of a strait between two Great Lakes. It's a strategic geographical site and a meaningful one. And so, there will be some kind of a human settlement there, but it's not going to be the Detroit of 1962, if you follow me. So all the efforts to make it be that again are probably not going to work out. These will be smaller places. But, how we deal with the salvage operations in the office buildings and the residential towers, that's going to be a huge challenge. The value will be there to disassemble them, but it will require a lot of capital to get it done. And, it'll be kind of an equation between the value of what you can get out of these structures and how much it costs to do it. And, and finally, there's the question of the oil industry itself. And when I wrote The Long Emergency, that paralleled the emergence of what was called the peak oil movement, which was simply a recognition among a large number of people that we were entering a troubled period for oil. And it happened in an interesting way. In the 1990s, the internet came along. And simultaneously with that, or coincidentally with that, a number of influential senior geologists started retiring out of the auto industry. And they started publishing their private dark thoughts about where the industry was headed. And usually nobody would read those essays they wrote, those journal entries, because they published them in these obscure trade journals, like, the Journal of the Colorado School of Mines or something like that. But because the internet was there all of a sudden, this information got onto the internet and it started spreading, and it started spreading awareness among the generalists in the population that we have a problem with oil. And most of these guys articulated it pretty well. They articulated the peak oil model pretty well, and it was probably pretty true. Now, what intervened around 2009-10 was the shale oil so-called miracle. And what that was adapting some not necessarily new technology. It had been around for a while, called fracking. But combined with computer telemetry for discovering wells and rock stratas and other complex calculations, they were able to combine horizontal drilling with a new kind of fracking. The old kind of fracking was done with explosives. The new kind of fracking was done by injecting water at high pressure into the rock strata and then injecting sand in it, and the rock strata would break open, the sand would hold the breaks open, and the oil would flow out of this otherwise impermeable rock. That was the problem before that was, unlike the sandstone stratas of the traditional conventional oil, this shale oil was impermeable. It didn't leak out when you sunk a pipe into it. You had to bust it open. Now, the difference between the old oil and the new oil was, you take like a Texas oil well of 1952 that cost $400,000 in today's dollars to drill that well. It produced thousands of barrels of oil a day for decades. So it was like a cash register. The initial capital investment was, nothing, and it just paid off for decades. Now, shale oil, on the other hand, it costs between $6 and $12 million per well in today's money to drill, horizontal drill, and frack, and service the fracking operations with the water trucks, the chemical trucks, and the sand trucks, and then to get the oil out of there in trucks. They probably produce, in the hundreds of barrels a day, maybe even 100 barrels a day for some of them. They, after the first year, they're down 60%, and after 3 years, they're done. So it's a totally different model. The conventional oil of Texas in 1952 and the shale oil in the Permian Basin of Texas today. They're very, very different. The problem with that now is that, they found a way to make it economical using zero interest loans for investment in the period after 2009. Now they've got a big problem is that so many of the drillers went out of business, went bankrupt in the period 2009 to 2020, that investors got shy about investing, and then the interest rates went back up. So it's no longer a low interest environment, and they have a business model challenge. Plus, they're running out of sweet spots to drill in the shale oil regions, the Bakken region in Dakota, the Permian in Texas, the Eagle Ford in Texas, and so on. And what's left is drilling oil in places that are very hard to work in, like offshore, underwater in the Gulf of Mexico, where you are on some kind of a platform, floating or otherwise, and you're going more than a mile or two maybe underwater, and then maybe another mile with the drill once you hit the bottom of the seabed. And when you're that far away from the drill bit, a lot of unexpected things can happen, and you get things like the Gulf of Mexico blowout that we got 15, 20 years ago, whenever that was. And that's it.
The saving grace with the offshore stuff is like how big some of those resources are.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. That's actually one of the sectors I'm invested in and find pretty interesting as far as set for the next 5 years. But the setup there it's pretty interesting just because of the size of the resource, and they're a lot closer to like the conventional decline rates where you can have some of these fields producing for 5, 10, 20 years if it's a real massive one. But I'd be curious to hear where you're gonna go before I cut you off there. So
well, I was just going to say that obviously there's some kind of a limit on this. It's not limitless, and a lot of that is governed by the pricing structure and the economies of scale, and whether or not you can continue to do this business economically while a whole bunch of other things are happening, like your manufacturing economy is collapsing, the financial sector is getting into terrible trouble, the currency's in terrible trouble, you don't have a stable currency, you have a lot of geopolitical friction, so that the distribution picture for oil, which is, as they say, a fungible resource, the oil in one place can be replaced with the oil from another place to some extent. There are differences, and some of the differences are interesting. Like the shale oil is so light that it doesn't contain a lot of the fractions of petroleum that we actually need the most. Like it doesn't contain heavier grades like aviation fuel, kerosene, and diesel. And America runs on diesel. In fact, the industrial world runs on diesel. And the shale oil is very, very stingy on that. So we have to get higher grade oils from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in order to, compensate for that problem.
Well, that was the thing about canceling the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada, is like their oil sands is like, that's basically what our refineries are geared towards, to mix with like the light oil. And I think that's, it's basically idiocy to cancel that pipeline.
And something about that we may not recognize is it may not be a reversible mistake. Once you make that mistake, 48 months prior, and now it's 48 months later, and things have changed in your culture and your economy and your society. Like maybe, the financing structure has changed and made it impossible for you to get that thing running again the way that you did before.
Or maybe Canada has a pipeline to the West Coast to export to China.
Yeah. So things have changed, as Bob Dylan said in the song. And I think that the bottom line of all this is that we are going to have problems with oil. It didn't drop off a cliff the way some of us, including me, predicted in 2005. But what we're probably looking at is a decade or so hiatus between what our predictions were during the peak oil years and the way it's actually going to play out. But what we're seeing also is so much accompanying disorder in other realms of human life that it sets up a dynamic that is extremely complex and has many points of fragility for things to go wrong. and that's the situation we're in now. Like in the United States, we're probably not going to be, put out of business by the oil situation, but we may be put out of business by the failures in banking and finance, and we may be in trouble with our inability to gear up enough manufacturing to make the stuff that we got to have, even the basic stuff, even stuff like machine tools and stuff like that. We don't have a workforce that is trained well enough to even work in some of these industries. So, and we have a tremendous amount of political instability. Another factor in the dynamic at work is the lack of trust in our government and institutions generally, that we've really blown that badly. And I don't know how you recover that, certainly not quickly.
Yeah. Have you,
And
oh, go ahead.
no, I've said enough for now. But
Oh,
it's a very complex, dynamic situation with a lot of moving parts, and they don't all have to go wrong. But if enough of them get into trouble at any given time, you're going to have big social problems, and each system that goes wrong is going to ramify the problems of the other systems that we depend on.
Yeah, I think to your point on the institutions and the government and the media, I think that reputation and the lack of trust, I think, is well earned.
Oh yeah.
But have you looked into, going back to oil, have you looked into the book, The Deep Hot Biosphere? The idea that a lot of these oil fields over time regenerate, and the source of a lot of these so-called fossil fuels is not actually like fossilized remains, is more comes from processes going on inside the earth constantly. Have you looked into that?
I've been following that for 10 years or more. I call it the theory of the creamy nougat center of the earth.
Yeah.
And I think it's horseshit. I don't think there's any question. Obviously, there's a lot going on in under the mantle of the crust of the earth, the crust and the mantle of the earth. But no, I don't think so. The main reason would be that the pressures below a certain strata of the Earth's crust are so great that liquid petroleum volatilizes, turns into a gas, and the heat and the pressure just make it very unlikely that you're going to get liquid resources coming out of that place. And I do think that the geology and the paleontology actually do suffice to explain how we get oil. It's not from dinosaurs. It's basically from one-celled algae-like organisms in primordial seas. But that's pretty much what it is. It's mostly stuff from the Carboniferous geological era of the Earth, and I wouldn't, as far as I know, there actually is not one example of a major oil field actually replenishing itself in the way that theory puts out. So,
Yeah. Well, I think that'd be
just
something
saying.
it would take a long time. It wouldn't be a overnight type deal, but it was just interesting. I think there's a lot of oil out there. It's just not going to be stuff that we're able to drill, I think, at 70 or $80 a barrel. So,
Well, it's certainly true and plausible that oil will migrate through permeable rock. It's just a question of, how far will it migrate laterally? If you have an oil field in one place and, you kind of drill it out and it's played out, does oil from, 10 miles away or 30 miles away somehow make its way into that? That could happen, but that's not the same theory.
yeah. So I guess the question is, with all these things going on, with all the stuff you're seeing coming down, basically down the way in the next 5, 10, 20 years on the long end, like, is there a way to avoid it, or is there a way America can turn it around, or is it basically you have to prepare for yourself and start getting ready, but there's no return journey to like turn the trends around?
I don't think there is, and I think that's generally true for most of the places in the world, although it's not going to work out or play out exactly the same for every society. You know, some societies are better disposed to get it on. I do think that what we're basically facing is what I would call a timeout from progress as we have known it. And that in itself has become kind of a curious religion. And we don't question it that much. The idea that everything will inevitably get better and better. Our comforts and conveniences will grow and get ever more refined. And, soon we'll be leading this life, the singularity life of leisure, where we're in a state of permanent robotic orgasm. That ain't going to happen. I think that we're going to see something that's like kind of going medieval for a long time. A timeout from progress is the best way to explain it. I wrote 4 novels in a series under the rubric of World Made by Hand. There are 4 of these books. I started around 2007, finished them about 2017. And the first one is called World Made by Hand. Second one's called The Witch of Hebron, and so on, so on. They're out there on Amazon. I made an effort to describe what I thought life in a small town in America in the East would be like under the circumstances of the kind of collapse I wrote about in The Long Emergency. And, it's basically it's more and more a pre-industrial life of people whose lives are centered on agriculture, one way or another. Population is way down. Electricity, the electric grid's not running anymore. They retain some knowledge about important things like, the germ theory of disease, and wash your hands before you deliver a baby, and how to do farming, although not on the agribusiness scale. And they enjoy many of the joys and comforts of being human. But the life of motoring and movies and streaming and internet and make a phone call and get a food delivery, that's all over. These people are living in very, very challenging circumstances, but they're not miserable. And part of the agenda of me writing those books was to depict a society that people might actually kind of like to live in. It has its appeals. It's not a dystopia like Mad Max or, The Road or anything like that. So I think that's what our destination is, pretty much.
If you had to guess, how long do you think that takes? 50 years, 100 years?
Oh, no, I think that, a few decades we're going to be well into it, because once things start collapsing in earnest, I think it's going to go pretty hard. As I said a few minutes ago, once you have major systems in free fall, they tend to amplify and ramify the adjoining system. So, for example, when if the electric grid becomes a problem, you're going to have trouble with everything from your town's water supply to anything you could think of, virtually refrigeration, the supermarket, storing food, being able to keep the lights on at night. I mean, anything.
Yeah.
Trucking, we're already having terrible problems in the trucking industry, and that's starting to be felt in the way that the amount of money that people have to pay for food. That's part of the inflation picture, and so on and so on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you see what inflation actually is, where Like there are at least certain things at the store that you buy every time you go, like clockwork, and it's like there's one thing I can think of where it's like the price of it has gone up twice in the last 3 months.
Yeah.
And inflation, if you believe CPI, is 3% or whatever. And it's like that's completely cooked. Like the joke of like what's his name, the New York Times guy, Paul Krugman. He was
Yeah.
like, "Here's your inflation once you remove food, energy, and rent." It's like, well, great, like thanks.
And that's how we calculate it. That's how the government bureaucrats calculate inflation. So it's ridiculous.
Yeah,
And you know, it's you know, talking about ramifying, you know, that just ramifies people's loss of trust in government. So you know, you have trouble in the financial area, and then you have this bureaucracy that's supposed to process the statistics about finance and economy, and they screw it up on purpose to hide the reality. And then, you know, people lose trust in government, and then that has a terrible effect.
yeah. Do you think we kind of muddle through and we get stuck in some sort of inflationary recession, kind of stagflation type environment, or
Well,
what do
we're
you kind
doing
of
that
think?
now. You know,
Yeah,
now we're kind of doing what we did in the 1970s, but I can see things getting a whole lot worse pretty fast. I can see the government and the Federal Reserve losing control of the value of the dollar and losing control of the bond market. That would be really simple. I mean, all we have to do is antagonize the BRICS nations a little more than we're already doing, and they'll just turn around and dump every U.S. Treasury piece of Treasury paper they got, and they'll totally queer the bond market, and that'll be the end of that. And you know, does the dollar go with that? Probably. So,
yeah,
and then what do you do? And, you know, are we going to end up being in a Weimar Republic situation? And the people ought to probably worry more about it. Right now, a lot of the anxiety about that is kind of ring fenced on the internet among the financial commentators themselves. And not everybody pays attention to those guys. You know, they're in their own little
yeah,
reservation. So, you know, you're not really getting much news on, you know, the legacy news media. You got to really seek it out. And even the guys, the financial guys, all have, they put out each one puts out a very different picture of where we're going.
yeah,
But yeah, you ought to be nervous
yeah. No,
about,
it's definitely time to be cautious, I think. And like it is funny, like you're saying with the media, like anytime you have like there's a TV on the gym wall that I go to, and they'll have CNBC on there sometimes, and you see the S&P up another 1%, Nvidia up 5 or whatever it was like a couple of weeks ago, where it's just like you see some of the stuff and it like makes no sense, but that's what they're talking about. I mean, they're going to get blindsided, or they know it's
yeah,
coming and they are basically talking their book because that's where the paychecks come from. But it is going to be an interesting 5 or 10 years, I think.
yeah.
But to go back to the media, do you think some of these companies have any shot at redemption with some? Because I know, like, I was looking at like right when the whole Trump thing happened, I was looking at the headlines. It's like Trump rushed off stage after loud popping noises, or
Yeah.
like you go down the list of the headlines. It's like Trump falls and rushed off the stage after disturbance in crowd or whatever. It's like I think they're probably too far gone and they're destined to go bankrupt unless, I mean, they're getting money from 3-letter agencies. But do you think there's any fixing, or you think it's just going to
I
be
doubt
a
it.
great time to be kind of a independent or small like podcast, or like, because I think that's what's been growing is the kind of independent media, the so-called unconventional media sources. But do you think there's
Yeah,
any
I think
fixing the
there's no
big ones?
question about it. And I don't see how they're going to redeem themselves. The great mystery to me, as someone who, you know, as a young man, I was a newspaper reporter and a magazine editor for a while before I dropped out to write books. And what amazes me is how dishonorable their behavior has been. The reporters themselves and the editors. It's like you can't tell me that the New York Times and CNN believes the bullshit that they've been putting out for the last 8 years. Russiagate, Ukraine Gate, impeachment gate, fine people, January 6th. It's all such bullshit transparently. And yet there don't seem to, when I was a newspaper reporter, most other reporters were in one way or another kind of misfits and rebels and people who were not cheerleaders for the establishment. And now they seem all to be. So, one might surmise that they're in the employ of the 3-letter agencies, or they're doing somebody's bidding. It's really pathetic. And I don't think they're gonna get over that. Just watching someone like Maggie Haberman, the reporter for the New York Times, just seeing her on TV last night, talking about the Republican convention was sickening. But one feature I want to mention, when I wrote the book, The Long Emergency, the one thing I left out, I think, was I did not predict or foresee how insane our society would get under the beginning stress of this long emergency, the first round of distress in what is looking like a kind of wholesale societal collapse. I kind of assumed that, there would be a normal distribution of mental health through that. But it turns out, no, that kind of thing really disorders the minds of large numbers of people. And that's why you got wokery, and that's why you got the Karens, and that's why you got the pandemic nuts.
That's why you've got women in the Secret Service and all these different things that should,
and drag queen story
happen.
Hours. And, I mean, the amount of psychopathology that arose out of, a fairly mild amount of early distress. That's impressive.
Do you think with some of the stuff you've seen that we get a shift back to more traditional roles for men and women, or do you think it's basically there's no brakes on this train, we're going to go to basically keep going down this path of insanity?
No, I think it actually reverses fairly quickly. And my model for that, I've said this before on podcasts, but my model for that is the Jacobin phase of the French Revolution. The Jacobins came along and really got power in 1793. They were the leftists in the National Assembly at the time. And they proceeded to turn French society upside down for a year. They changed the calendar, they stuck in an extra month. They changed the working week from 7 to 10 days. They changed all kinds of customs and manners by force. They forced people to behave certain ways. And after a year of their bullshit, everybody else in France had enough of them, and they were overthrown really fast. They were led by Robespierre, who was a lawyer, and his claque of other lawyers, and they were taken out and put into the guillotine, and that was the end of them. And you didn't hear much about them, or even a program remotely like their revolutionary program, for more than 100 years, when the Bolsheviks came along. And then they sort of replayed the Jacobin psychodrama. But I think that this will reverse fairly rapidly, and especially as a lot of what we're seeing just has to do with the changes in the divisions of labor starting in the 1970s, where so many jobs could be done by just anybody. That's not going to be the case up ahead. You're going to need men to do jobs and women to do their jobs. We're going to have to get a redivision of labor in ways that makes enough sense so that you can raise children and have a household that hangs together.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't mind seeing less of the what I like to call adult daycare jobs, like HR and some of the stuff you mentioned, where it's just they're a drag on the rest of the economy. But I think I've had discussions with bunch of different people. And like you said, I think we're at least hopefully headed in the right direction on this stuff. I think one of the things that we were going back and forth on is I think that like in 5 or 10 years, like it's going to be that quick. I think like stay-at-home mom is going to be like a status symbol for women. Like they'll brag about it on social media, and like whereas over the last 15 years, it was all about the like girl boss or whatever you want to term it.
Class
And
ceiling.
yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it's already happening. You know, that's why the phenomenon of Peachy Keenan, the author and Twitter star, has
Hmm.
come along.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to watch because I think I'm not sure if this is always the case, but I think social media has probably accelerated a lot of these like trend shifts and changes where stuff that usually in the past would take years is like it's basically sped up into hyperdrive where a lot of these shifts can happen like be driven by one big event, or like it's just something where it picks up steam, goes viral, and it starts to spread very quickly. So it'll be interesting to see if social media continues to be a big influence. But
Yeah,
um,
it kind of depends on how regular the electric service remains. I'm
yeah,
convinced that you know, the electric grid is one of the more fragile modules in our systems of systems, and we
hmm,
take it for granted. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the electric grid becomes a soft target for terrorists in the US, including whoever came across the border in the last 3 years.
yeah,
Uh, and here's another weird thing. You know, if the authorities mess with Americans too much over things like digital money or AI, I think that there will be a group of Americans who will be highly motivated to take the electric grid down so that stuff can't be used against them. And that's only a matter of, you know, going around with a deer rifle shooting out relays and transformers. The electric grid is such a hugely distributed system of soft targets. It's not funny.
yeah. It's definitely getting old up there in age too for a lot of this
Yeah,
stuff. And
like
you
me.
look at you look at some of the stuff you see with power demand for AI and all these projections that I think are probably overdoing it, but it's still going to be interesting to see how fast that grows. Like, unless someone can basically cut all the red tape and start building nuclear as fast as possible and natural gas for more short term, like it's it's going to be interesting. I think there's a lot of bottlenecks in like systems, like you said, we take for granted nowadays. So
Yeah, and in a way, we've also blown the opportunity to do these things at a time when it would have been possible to do them. Like, you know, we're moving into a period that will probably be characterized by capital scarcity or scarcity of capital. You know, because so many of the things that represent capital today are just figments of the financial system. And as they are discovered to be valueless, money will disappear. And that money is capital. Um, so we could have built a high-speed rail system in America if we started 40 years ago. Um, but now it's too late for that. The capital is not going to be there, and the political will has not been there for 40 years. So that's out of the question. Nuclear is probably very capital intensive. I'm kind of guessing about that at the moment, but I think it probably is fairly capital intensive, and it depends at what scale you're able to do it at. You know, there's a lot of chatter about being able to do nuclear at smaller scale, but I don't know. Are we going to have the money to do that? It's a very complex operation, and um, one of the main ways that we've gotten ourselves into the trouble we're in is by making over investments in complexity. And so the picture that I've been trying to draw of the future is a picture which uniformly decomplexifies so that there are fewer failure points in our the armature of our daily life.
yeah, the one of the things that I think is interesting there, and I'm not sure if this is a feature or a bug, but one of the things you're saying about like these changes couldn't get made during the good times, but I think it's almost kind of the default that there has to be a crisis or some sort of major shift to get the cooperation, support, and the buy-in from enough people to say, you know what, we're going to build a whole bunch of nuclear reactors because we want to have electricity and like all these things that have been taken for granted. But once, like, yes, it would have been simpler to start building these things 2 decades ago, but I don't know if you have an opinion on that, if it needs a crisis to happen or.
Well, crises do tend to prompt people into action. And I don't think there's any question that that's true. But, for a lot of choices that have been made in Western Civ over the last half century were not necessarily made out of crisis. The France did not build its high-speed rail system because they were in a crisis. Same with Germany, Spain, etc. They
Yeah.
did it because it seemed like it would be a good idea. China too, they didn't do it because they were in a crisis of transportation. They did it because they thought it would be a fabulous investment in their economic future. We, on the other hand, so we missed that window when those great projects happened mostly in the 80s, 90s, and forward. But we have a conventional railroad system that's just sitting out there rusting in the rain. And, if we could fix that, that would help us a lot, because this is a large continental sized nation, and it might be very hard to get around it if not everybody has a car in the future. And, we need some kind of a, fundamental intercity railroad system, or intertown railroad system. And it looks like we don't have the political will to do that either. Where I live, there are countless rail lines that have been decommissioned and are sitting out there rusting in the rain, and we're not doing anything with it. So,
Yeah,
it's hard to be optimistic about that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think that's where I was talking with Mike Ferris the other day, and like I'm very pessimistic on say the next 3 to 5 years. I think like you said, there's a lot of problems in a lot of different areas, culture, society, markets. But like I think 10, 20 years out, I think there's a lot of changes that are coming. I think I'm pretty optimistic. That might be a little bit naive, but I don't know. I think kind of have to be an optimist at least a little bit on some of these things too.
Yeah, I think that we're facing a period of significant disorder that is going to make people's lives difficult. I don't think it doesn't have to be apocalyptic. It doesn't have to be the road, but it's going to be challenging, and it's mostly going to be a lowering of your standard of living one way or another.
Yeah. So I guess we can start to wrap it up here. Is there anything we missed? Anything else that we should touch on before we wrap up?
Well, not really. I think we spelled it out. Just brace yourself for the next 3-4 months ahead, and all the weird things that could potentially happen. And keep your hat on, and keep your powder dry, and be kind to the people around you if you can.
Yeah. The closing question I came up with is, what book do you think I should add to my reading list? Can be history, finance, investments.
Gee, I don't know. You tend to, oh God, off the cuff. I mean, there's so many. I can't begin to tell you. But for me, I think it would be worthwhile to start reading things around the psychologist Carl Jung, who has a lot to say about archetypal human behavior and models and personalities and situations that are archetypal, because we are going through some kind of a weird archetypal transition here with archetypal persona and circumstances. The assassination attempt on Trump was a perfect example because it elevated him instantly, overnight, from kind of a questionable buffoon-like character to kind of a real American hero of a sort. Now, I don't know how much I jump on that bandwagon, but I would say that his esteem has changed in the eyes of his fellow citizens in a significant way. And what does it say about the movement that he leads? And I think what it says is people have had enough of being fucked around.
Yeah, he's definitely kind of turned into a little bit of a figurehead at this point. That it's the old quote is there are decades where nothing happens and like weeks where decades happen. I think
Lenin,
it could be.
I think.
Yep, it is. It's I think we're kind of in one of those like 4-month, 5-month stretches where a lot of things are going to change in a lot of ways. 2024 is probably going to set the table for how the rest of the decade goes. So
yeah,
it's interesting, but I think that's a good place to wrap it up. So thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.
A pleasure, Ben. I'll see you next time.